And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good. For those who are called according to his purpose. What a mighty promise. I think because of my upbringing, I'm just a little bit partial for this passage to the King James Version.
Right.
And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. I want to preach today with the Lord's help about the challenge of all. All things. The challenge of all. This past week for me was one of the most memorable weeks of my life. Started out the week with a life-changing low point. Ended off the week a life-changing high moment. All in just a couple of days' time. We're set to leave to go to our National Baptist Convention on Saturday morning, and received a phone call from my parents on Friday morning, pretty early in the morning. Figured I better answer it, and received news that my grandmother was ill, was in the hospital, and getting some tests done. As the day progressed, my phone continued to ring. Seemed like every time my phone rang, the news got worse. And I found out that she had had a heart attack. And the phone kept ringing, and discovered she had a stroke and a blood clot in her brain and needed surgery. And just kind of contemplated my travel plans, leaving on the next day. My parents encouraged me to continue with my plans. End of the day, I concluded that was probably best, really for two reasons. First is that, well, really three reasons. First is that I guess in my rational mind, I concluded that my physical presence wasn't going to change anything. Secondly, I was comforted by a number of family that were present and a number of family that were making travel plans to be there before nightfall. Probably the thing that gave me the most comfort is I knew that God could be at both places at the same time. So anyhow, I continued with my plans and made it safely and continued to get reports. And on my way to worship on Sunday morning, phone rang again, and things were not well. So I just kind of prayed and went on to worship and made my way to my ultimate destination. Tuesday morning, I woke up to a text message that said, "Call me when you can." Got the message that my grandmother had passed. And it was it just hit me. Just like many of you, when you receive that phone call. And it really was a challenging day. No family. Phone started ringing off the hook. Just really wanted some time. But it was kind of difficult, I tried to not engage phone calls as much as possible. A few people that I spoke to seemed to attempt to be comforting, but they kept giving me their logic. And I just wanted to be sad. And by Thursday, Sonia showed up, and just something about having my wife present that just kind of gave me permission a little bit to be me and not the president. So Friday morning, I was scheduled to preach before our national convention, the president, and I'm not quite sure why, but the Lord has granted me much favor with our national leader. I can't figure out why that's the case, but it is. So it was the same time that I was scheduled to preach was the same time that there was a memorial service in Raleigh, North Carolina. Same day, same time. I just wanted to be there, but I had an assignment. And an amazing thing took place with the Lord's help. He really allowed me the opportunity to focus on what He has sent me there to do. And I need to tell you, Antioch, it was a great blessing to see some of Antioch in the house. Amen. Brian and Reese drove 16 hours to be there. And they're technically not members yet. It was such a refreshing encouragement to see some faces from Sunday morning. Our state representation from Nebraska was much larger than anticipated. There were some people that I ran into that came down on Thursday just to be with me on Friday. So I said what the Lord told me to say, and our president, Dr. Young, gave some remarks, and some of the things he said to me privately during the week were so encouraging to me. Some of the things he said publicly before our national body just really meant a lot. So my assignment was done. It was time to come back home. We finally made it to Denver for our connecting flight. And it was there that I really, for the first time, had a moment just to reflect on all that had took place throughout the week. The low and the high. Sonia and I were sitting at the restaurant waiting on our food, and I don't even know if she was aware of it, but I was just kind of talking to the Lord, asking him, what do you want me to say to the people on Sunday? I had prepared to start another sermon series on today, and God spoke. And this is what he said to me. He said, all things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are called according to his purpose. And that's what he said to me. And then I just began to think about the lows and the highs. In light of what God spoke to me in that airport, all things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are called according to his purpose. And I began to think about all.
All right.
And so it was right then that I knew I needed to suspend what I had normally planned to begin to preach about for the next month, and perhaps we'll get to it on next Sunday, but wanted to talk to us today about the challenge of all. And there's some things in the text that I believe can help us today kind of wrap our mind and our hearts and our actions around all. You know, it would seem to be an easier pill to swallow if the Bible said some.
Yeah.
Right.
Bless you.
It would seem manageable if the Bible said most. But the challenge is, the Bible doesn't say some things. Doesn't even say most things. Text says all things work together for good to them that love God,
Yeah.
to them who are called according to his purpose. And so Antioch, my beloved Antioch, if we're really going to accept the challenge of all, then I'm convinced that we have to embrace the scope of all. The scope of all. It sounds just too literal to be true, but sometimes the simplest stuff is the most impactful. The scope of all is simply this: all. That's if you really want to respond to the challenge of all, you have to embrace the scope of all. And that literally is everything.
Right.
And it really leads us to deal with, to embrace this theological concept or truth called the sovereignty of God. And that just simply says that he is, was, and will forever be in complete control. That's the scope of all. Nothing happens in this life that doesn't first go by the desk of God. Either he caused it, created it, or he allowed it to be. But scope of all teaches us he's in complete control. So if it happens, there's no experience in life that is wasted if he's in control. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Help us preach. Amen.
There's nothing that's worthless. No experience, no situation that is beyond or outside of God. That's the scope of all. In my case, was from suffering and pain, a dose of loneliness, to opportunity and service, being used by the Master. In other cases, it's angry one moment, depressed the next. Some cases is unforgiveness and bitterness, doubt or confusion, despair, or whatever it is that we deal with. God is always in control. All.
That's right.
And I just believe that one of the challenges of all is to settle with the fact that no matter what it is, if it's a high or if it's a low, that it's all encompassing under the sovereign, mighty hands of the Almighty God. Nothing's outside of it. Nothing's beyond. All leads us to God in everything. That's a part of the challenge of all. It's embracing scope. No matter what it is, he's there. So there's this embracing the scope of all, and I think built upon that is waiting on the work in all.
Help us, preacher.
The text says, and we know all things work together. The challenge is waiting on the work of God in all.
Okay.
Can I tell you why it's a challenge? Too many times, in my estimation, we are concluding too quickly about what God is doing.
Right.
And no sooner than we have an experience, Sometimes we think we know
Right.
what God is doing,
Mm-hmm.
and we think we know why God is doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And far too many times we give our opinion to other people
Mm-hmm.
about what God is doing
Okay.
and why He's doing it.
Right.
I'm grateful for some of the things that I've tried to do and not to do when responding to people in grief. And I am completely convinced that to a large extent that there's a lot of teaching and training that needs to take place
Yeah.
how to respond to people when they go through sadness.
That's right.
Far too many times
Mm-hmm.
there are those who wanted to give their conclusion on the matter.
Mm.
Right, right.
She lived a good life, they said. She's not suffering. She's with the Lord. It's not so much that those things aren't true. It's that sometimes they're just premature. God is still working.
Right. Right.
And we have to give God time to work.
Mm.
There are some things in your lives that have taken place years ago,
Mm-hmm.
and He's still working.
Right.
Help us, preacher.
Right.
That's right.
God doesn't operate on our timetable.
Mm-hmm.
Right, right.
He's involved in all, the scope of all, but waiting on the work in all things is quite a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I could have made some conclusions in my mind about Friday's experience of preaching to our national convention, and well, God must be doing this, and now this is going to happen, and He's going to do this and this, and I'm gonna, and all that kind of stuff. And sometimes, y'all,
All right.
we get into a hurry to think we know.
Right. Right.
Sometimes we give our interpretation prematurely.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge is just let Him work.
Mm.
Let Him work without your conclusions. Let Him work without your interpretations. Trust God.
Yeah.
Give Him time. The song, when we were a kid, said, "You can't hurry God.
Mm-hmm.
Just have to wait. Trust Him, give Him time, no matter how long it takes. He's God. Can't hurry. He'll be there. Don't you worry. May not come when you want Him.
Mm. That's
Always
all right
on time.
there. Mm.
Anyhow, that's the challenge of all.
Mm.
Embracing the scope of all, waiting on the work in all. Just let God do what He's going to do. Sometimes we spend energy trying to stop it because we don't like it. Just wait on it.
Yeah.
Just pump your brakes, and a good way to practically wait on the work of God, a good way to do that is practice silence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Practice silence. Talk to Him privately.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the less you say publicly gives God opportunity to do what He's going to do. There's another challenge of all. The first one has to do with embracing the scope of all. The second one has to do with waiting on the work in all. The third one perhaps may be even more challenging, and that is recognizing the good comes from all things.
All right.
Again, the Bible says, and we know, all things work together for good.
Right.
And the challenge is recognizing
Yeah.
the good. Because sure enough, there's a whole lot that goes into all. And sometimes in our overestimation of ourselves, we'll label something as good or bad. And it's only from our perspective.
Right.
And when that happens, sometimes we totally miss what good really is. And can I tell you what God's good is not?
All right.
Comfort. God's good is not comfort. And if your good is comfort, you're going to label something good or bad that may not line up with what God considers to be good.
Right.
Because you're judging good based upon your criteria of good. Far too often, our good is comfort-based,
Right.
pleasure-based, or avoidance of pain-based. And we take our earthly criteria and try to pray away what God is working
Right.
for good. So if God's good is not comfort and pleasure and the avoidance of pain, then what is God's good? So that we can recognize it in all.
Help us,
All
preacher.
right.
That's a valid question. And I believe that the answer to what is God's good is found right in the next verse. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined, here it is, to be conformed to the image of his Son. God's good is to work in all things to make us more like Jesus. And whatever makes us more like Jesus is good. And I'm here to tell you, sometimes highs make us more like Jesus. Sometimes lows
Help us, preacher.
make us more like Jesus. Sometimes joy makes us more like Jesus. Sometimes sorrow makes us more like Jesus. Sometimes victory makes us more like Jesus. Sometimes adversity makes us more like Jesus. The challenge of all is to recognize God's good. Can I give you an example? If it leads you to pray,
All right.
It's good.
All right.
no matter what it is, if it drives you to the master, and without it you would not have been driven to the master, whether it's an up experience or a down experience, whether it's a joyful experience or a painful experience, whether it's sorrow or whatever it is, if it drives you to talk to God, it's good. Let me give you another example. If it forces you to open this book, whatever it is in life, if it leads you here, it's good. No matter what it is that leads you here. Somebody could have lied on you, talked about you, mistreated you. But if it leads you to the Word of God, if it drives you to prayer, if it compels you to walk in the doors of the church on a Sunday morning, whatever does that is good. And we would do well, Antioch, to learn to recognize the good that comes from all things.
Wow.
You know that all things happen for a reason thing is shallow. It's shallow, y'all. I would encourage you to stop saying it. Good is what drives you to God.
All right, all right.
That's going to help you. That all things happen for a reason and all those other seemingly helpful cliches, they just don't have enough depth to them. They don't stick. But this, recognizing good and understanding that if it's a high or a low, a good or a bad, and it drives you to God, God says, that's good.
Right.
And the thing about it is, I told you the scope of all things. If it happens, God either made it, caused it, allowed it, and He knows how much of this and how much of that. And only the things that He causes or allows to happen, all of those things can be good. Because if He allowed them, ultimately it's His desire for those things, all of those things, to lead you to Him. So that He can do what He's trying to do, which is to make His people more like His Son. That's the challenge of all. You got to embrace the scope. Every experience. You got to wait on the work. Sometimes it takes time for God to work. You got to recognize the good. God's good is always what makes us more like His Son. So, whether you're happy or sad, if you're more like Jesus, it's good. And I think the challenge is for us to stop thinking good according to our criteria and start thinking good according to His. What His plan, what His ultimate purpose for our lives is. And all the stuff that He allows to happen to us. He's got one goal for His people. Make them like Jesus. That's always been His only plan for you and I. Anything that pushes that agenda, whether we go willingly or kicking and screaming, if it leads us to Him, it's good. Here's the last challenge of all. For some it might be the easiest, for some it might be the most difficult. I already talked about embracing the scope of all. I already talked about waiting on the work in all. We talked about recognizing the good that comes from all. The last one is becoming the them in all.
All right, all right.
How do we become the them? Who is the them? The text says, and we know all things work together for good to them,
To them.
not to everybody.
Right.
Right.
God working in all to bring about his purposes, that ain't for everybody.
Right.
It's for an exclusive group of people that the text identifies as them. To them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose.
Right.
How do I become one of them? So that I can learn to embrace the scope of all, so that I can learn to wait on the work of all, so that I can recognize the good of all, I had to become one of them. The only way, Antioch, you can become one of them, those who love God, those who are called according to his purpose, you got to know Jesus for yourself. It's the only way to become one of them, is to know Jesus for yourself. Because here's what I know. It's good to know Jesus when you're up. Keeps you hungry. Here's what I know. It's good to know Jesus when you're down. He knows how to lift you.
Right.
Here's what I'm convinced of. It's good to know Jesus when you're scared. He can be there for you. It's good to know Jesus when you're depressed. He can heal you. It's good to know Jesus when you have doubts. He can respond to them. It's good to know Jesus when you're in pain. I'm convinced that whatever it is that's a part of your all, it's better to know Jesus than to deal with all without Jesus.
Right.
I am reaffirmed in this one thing. Sometimes I don't know how people make it without Jesus.
Right.
What they have to hold on to. How do they survive all of life without Jesus? Maybe I've been walking with him for long enough that I've forgotten what that might have been like, but I'm here today to tell you, Antioch, it's good to know him. And if you don't know him, you need to get to know him.
Right.
Because the challenge of all is hard enough as it is.
Yeah.
Without having to deal with all without Jesus. I'm looking at faces who've been dealing with all. Just looking at some of your faces and knowing some of what you've been through. And all I can tell you is whatever it is, it's a part of all. You got to embrace it. You got to wait. You got to recognize when the good is happening. And you can't do any of that if you don't know Jesus. So what shall we say to these things today, Antioch? To the challenge of all and becoming one of them. My conclusion today is simple. Time is filled with swift transition. Not on earth unmoved can stand. Build your hopes on things eternal. Hold God's unchanging hand. Trust in Him who will not leave
Yes,
you.
yes.
Whatsoever years may bring, if by earthly friends forsaken, still closely to Him cling. Hold to His hand, anyhow. God's unchanging hand. Let's sing that hymn. 248.